Welcome everyone. Glad you're able to make it today. We're going to be starting here momentarily as we let folks enter the webinar. Hope everyone's having a good day so far. Good afternoon, Huskies, and welcome to our second installment of our Elevate Career Hacks Online Professional Development Workshop. My name is Patrick Walker, and I am the Director of Alumni Relations Regional Engagement here at the UConn Office of Alumni Relations. On behalf of the UConn Foundation, we are excited for today's discussion on negotiation and showcasing your value. Before we begin, a few areas of note to help you manage your webinar participation this afternoon. There will be an opportunity to ask questions by typing them into the question box on your control panel. Feel free to type them in as you think of them, and we will address as many as we can throughout and at the end of the session. A survey will be sent to you as a follow-up. We appreciate it if you would fill out the survey so we can continue to bring you the types of webinars that you are looking for to enhance your careers. And finally, this webinar will be recorded. Please visit our YouTube page at youtube.com/UConn alumni sometime later this week to review and to view previously recorded presentations. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our presenters. Our moderator is Jennifer Grunwald, class of 2002 and 2007. She is an adjunct faculty instructor for career management and the graduate career coach for the MBA program at the School of Business. Joining us also is Penny Davis, class of 2003, CEO and principal consultant of the Aurora Group. And finally, Suzanne Barth, class of 1983 and 86, Executive Vice President and Chief People Officer at Cinity. Jennifer, it is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining today, and a special thank you to Penny and Suzanne for taking all of the questions that I'm going to throw at you in just a few minutes. I'm excited and I'm honored to be able to facilitate the conversation today. So negotiation, this is a topic that comes up quite often in my conversations with students and alums, and we have a lot to cover, so let's dive right in. So the first question I want to ask to both of you, when we hear the word negotiation, many of us feel a level of discomfort. I think anyone in this who's watching right now can probably share that sentiment. At least once or twice, they've felt a little uncomfortable. So what are some tips and strategies for overcoming this feeling and finding confidence in showcasing one's value to a current or a prospective employer? Penny, do you want to dive in first?
Sure. Thank you so much. I think that it's natural first to say that that level of uncomfortableness that someone might feel. I think to help an individual get over that is to really plan for the conversation, develop clear idea of what you hope to achieve and where are your boundaries. Also, I think it's also important to think about understanding, your value, what you bring to the table, not the value in terms of your self-worth, but the value of your skills, knowledge, and abilities. I think that helps gauge for your partner whom you be negotiating with, your level of comfortableness and building trust with that individual, establishing a dialogue that the person can feel is organic, that you're sharing information and how you bring value to the organization sometimes helps settle that level of uncomfortableness that people feel, and communicating clearly and effectively.
I'll just add, I think people forget it's a give and take, right? There's negotiation on both sides. And whether you're doing a new job, which I think can bring its own sense of anxiety, you want that job, you're looking to negotiate. On the other hand, if it's looking for negotiation internally when you have a job, there's a different set of anxieties and making sure you're understanding your worth, the relationship, what's going on. So I think it's all about doing your homework and, just finding that inner strength. You made it here. Don't feel that imposter syndrome. Like I don't, shouldn't be asking. It's a negotiation from both sides, and both sides can be decision makers in that. So I think it's all about, as you said, planning and really understanding you and your worth and trying to put yourself on the other side of the table as well.
I think you both mentioned preparation, planning, you just said, Suzanne. So that leads really nicely into the next question. So prior to a negotiation meeting, what are some specific steps a candidate should, or a current or employee, if they're looking for an internal negotiation, what are some steps they should take to research and prepare for a negotiation meeting?
I think if it's negotiating, say, for a salary, which oftentimes is, I think, do some homework. I would just caution you, salary.com, which a lot of people go to and say, oh, I'm da 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 da. Those are self-reported. So you don't know the validity of those. Most companies subscribe to salary surveys. So the way it works is you submit what your pay is, obviously anonymized, and then they amalgamate, kind of combine all that and come back to you with a salary survey that typically companies subscribe to, and that allows them to do their benchmarks. And then the benchmarks are typically a range within different levels, and that's how companies can have internal equity and really look at the positions and the skills that go with them. So it's a pretty complex, when you look at salary surveys, there's size of company, revenue, people, industry, geography. There's all kinds of things that go into determining salaries. So I would encourage you to just look at the sources you do have, but take them in that vein, that there are professional surveys that a lot of companies subscribe to. And I'm not asking you to be comp consultants at all, but if you look at job postings, a lot of job postings now, in some states it's required to put the range. So if you think you are, qualified for that job, you can look at that. Another thing to think about when you're doing your homework and in the negotiation, a lot of states now can't ask you, what do you make now? Right? They can say what range, what are you looking for? And you can give them a range, but some places you cannot, they can't ask you specifically what you make. So I would say, kind of do that, look at, your skills and what they may be in the marketplace based on position descriptions and go from there.
Anything to add there, Penny, for the steps candidates should take for researching and preparing? Anything you wanted to add?
I think it's also important to think about managing your emotions, exercising a high degree of emotional intelligence. Many folks underestimate how emotions can come into play when you're having conversations. Very rarely are conversations had in person. So taking the opportunity, if it's happening via phone or via email, to just manage those emotions.
Great. You had said something, Suzanne, about the salary survey. Is that I don't know if I missed that part, but is that a website? Is that something that everyone has access to, or is that more kind of an internal?
Well, there's two things. One is there's salary surveys that companies subscribe to, and they get the data for sharing their data. But people typically, or a lot of times, go out onto websites like salary.com, and you can, plug in your title and plug in this and plug in that, and you'll get kind of a graph. And I'm just saying, use those with caution as you negotiate. I've had people present that to me, and then you get into how does compensation really work conversation, and the nuances of that. But I would also say, make sure you know your level and your skills and your competencies so you can articulate that. Do you have supervisory experience? Do you have global experience? Do you have, working cross-functional teams? Make sure you kind of take your own inventory of the skills that you've gathered over your career.
Right. And I know I've heard of like Glassdoor and those other ones. So kind of similar there, it sounds like, is take those all with, and I've seen certainly some things that have not looked right on that type of.
Yeah, just remember it's self-reported. So you go in and you put it, and people can put whatever they like.
That's right.
And think about geography as well. Sometimes, because of where you live, you may receive a premium pay. So for example, if you live in a high cost of living area such as San Francisco or New York, in comparison to more rural space, the compensation may change.
Sure. And then when you're looking at those job postings, and Suzanne had alluded to that, looking at job postings to kind of see the range, if that is in fact posted, and many do have to, sometimes there's these crazy ranges, right? So it's like, sure, 60 to 120,000, right? Well, that's a huge range. Do you find in your experience that you really want to be looking at the lower end of it all the time, but they just kind of post this large range to get more applicants? What's your take on those large ranges that are sometimes posted?
Well, ranges are typically built to be large overlapping ranges as you go through. And I would say, there's a medium, and there's what they call the min and the max. If you're new to that level and you're new to that role and that skill set, you could probably expect to be somewhere between the min and the mid. So the 25th percentile to the 50th percentile. As you move through careers, you kind of move through that pay range. And probably when you're at, up towards the 75th percentile, you're probably getting ready for your next promotion and moving to that next level where you would be put into a higher band. So just recognize that you move through these bands, these ranges, and that's why there is a range. And some of it is dependent on your experience in that role at that level.
What might be helpful to you is to ask the employer what kinds of skills and experience would separate the lower end from the mid-range or even the higher end. If you're thinking about opportunities in government such as municipality or state government, oftentimes there's an indicator that it's a requirement that you start at the lower end, but it doesn't hurt for you to ask the question, could alternate salary be considered?
So we all think about being prepared and all the words that we have to say, and am I going to sound good? What is the right language that I use? But there's this emotional intelligence piece that Penny, you shared a little bit. Discuss how that does play in. How does emotional intelligence and demeanor, and I'll even go on to say likability, how does that all play into negotiations, and what advice can you give?
I think it's important to start off knowing what your strengths and weaknesses are, having a good sense of self-confidence. Also to listen to the other party. They may have constraints that they're dealing with in terms of a budget constraint or a salary range constraint, and asking questions about that helps you understand their positioning, but also helps you kind of negotiate that conversation. But having a high degree of listening skills, I think, is really helpful in developing that emotional intelligence that's needed for negotiations.
Yeah, I can't emphasize that enough. Listening for hearing, not listening for responding. So really listen to what they're saying, the nuances of that, and just, be polite, be respectful. It is a tough position to be in. It's one of these difficult conversations, but if you approach it with, are you willing to look at other alternatives or other ranges, or, just be polite about it. And I think people are responsive.
Treating it like a conversation too, I think, is really important. It's a two-way, street for sure. Yeah. So there is this kind of misconception that salary is the only negotiable thing on the table, right? But there's, especially if you're listening and you're hearing that maybe there are constraints for why the salary can't be increased. What are some other things that folks can negotiate beyond salary that could be really valuable and helpful?
Well, thinking about salary in terms of total compensation, most folks are familiar with their base salary, which is really the fixed amount of money that an employee receives for the compensation of their work, typically on an annual basis. On their variable pay, such as bonus, commission, profit sharing. There's also benefits. Those benefits tend to be fixed, healthcare, dental, life insurance, but there are also privileges. So there may be memberships, flexible work hours, remote work opportunities, childcare, and other types of benefits that can be negotiated. I would say from my experience, if there's already a policy or program in place, it's very unlikely that the employer can modify those benefits because those are programs that have already been established. But if there's no program established, there's a strong likelihood, if you can present the business case for the employer, that it's worth establishing.
And I would just add that, just as someone doesn't leave their job just for salary, you don't go to a job just for salary. It's really the whole package you need to take into consideration. And is there an opportunity to get supervision experience or leadership experience? Can you, maybe negotiate for more PTO or a sabbatical or whatever the things that are important to you in terms of this role and the things you want to achieve with this company and this, that it's beyond income is important. I don't want to negate that, but there are other things. Are you going to go work for a great boss who's really going to inspire you and excite you and you're going to learn from? That to me is just as important.
Couldn't say that enough. Thank you for raising that.
Right, right. I know I used to say the term shop for your boss a little bit to some folks who are really fixated on salary. That having supervision, having someone who you see eye to eye with and you'd work well together is very, very helpful. Any specific scenarios that the two of you can recall where you've seen kind of maybe some odd things negotiated, or just some really good like success stories where you've seen folks be really successful in their negotiating?
I can think of a time where a candidate was negotiating a change in vacation accrual policy. And I think that posed a challenge for the organization because we had to set policy and it would be precedent setting. So I would say just think through what the parameters are for that organization. Many times organizations post what their benefits and privileges are. Take a glance and try to understand what kind of latitude can be offered. Because I think in this circumstances, they were requesting some leave up front and they weren't an employee as yet. And so it's difficult to grant something that challenges an existing policy.
Mm.
Yeah, I would agree. It's hard when you want to start making exceptions because then you really need to look at it, the internal equity, and just remember if you were that other person and not getting the exception granted for. I would also say, a lot of times you hear you need to know your walk away position, right? This is a two-way street. This is a negotiation. You have just as much power to say yes as no as the employer. But just remember, don't bluff, because if you say you're going to walk away, but don't come back and say, oh, change my mind. So that's, be solid in what you're willing to compromise on or not.
Mm-hmm.
I've also seen some really good success stories where a candidate asked for coverage to attend certain conferences, and that person was going to be headline speaking at conferences, and that brings credibility to the organization. So again, leverage your experience and your talents to help get things that are important to you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the external footprint can be a large negotiator.
This is true. Right. Okay, so when is it appropriate to negotiate? And we know when it is appropriate, but when should one hold off? So we know there's times when it just isn't.
Well, if you've done your homework and you know that they're coming in with a solid offer or a solid package, you can, ask a little bit, but I wouldn't push too hard. Because how you come into an organization and how you act during the interview, the negotiation, everything else sort of sets the tone as well. So I think that, just know when to, and that goes back to the listening, really listen. So where you feel that this is a win-win for both of you.
Yeah, in many cases, an employer might reach out verbally and offer you the opportunity and have conversations with you about your interest. And I think that's probably not a good time to begin negotiations. I think you would want to wait until you have a written offer. And again, think about those things that are most important to you and articulate them. I think it's very important to articulate those needs and desires to that employer. And when you're negotiating, don't negotiate point for point. You kind of need to negotiate multiple things simultaneously. And if you're pushed to, give a salary range for an expectation at that time, you may say you're looking for, more information about the role before you set that expectation. You can take a pause. You do have that opportunity to take a pause if needed.
So when you say kind of negotiate multiple things simultaneously, can you talk about like what that would sound like and what that would look like? Because could it sound as though you're trying to get so much and turn the employer off? I've heard that before, where I've also heard that that is good to do, but if I come in and I start asking for a bump in salary, or I start asking for more vacation or whatever it is, more than one thing at a time, does that just look like I'm greedy and I'm asking for so much?
Yeah, I always use the rule of thumb of three or less. You know, I think it's good to start off with three important things that you desire, but make the case for yourself on what it is that why it's important to you, but also why should it be important to the employer as well. In any negotiation, it's both parties want to walk away feeling like they both got something out of it, and so therefore, if you're able to articulate not only why it's important to you, but why it would be a win for them, it certainly help you with leveraging.
Anything to add there, Suzanne? Or
I think that just one thing that was occurring to me, when you're in these negotiations, you may be juggling other jobs, and one thing you can negotiate is when you need to get back to them. You know, sometimes people want you to get back right away, and you may have, you know, other things brewing. Nothing ever really happens in a nice, neat order. And you know, you could use that as, you know, just, hey, I'd like to think about this. Can I have, you know, the weekend or whatever it is? I mean, there's the thing is asking politely and earnestly versus demanding. I think that's the key.
I like what you said too, Penny, about stating kind of why it's important to you. And I don't know if that's exactly how you stated it, but what it kind of meant for me was, so if professional development is something of interest and you want to negotiate 2 conferences a year that they're going to pay for, right? The company is going to pay for, stating that professional development and excelling in my career and growing is really important to me. This is why I'm asking for this. I think that can be really, really helpful to show that party. And I'm thinking that's what you were saying too, right? That could be really, really helpful to the employer to say, okay, this person isn't negotiating just to negotiate, right?
Absolutely, you've hit it on the mark.
We do
Yeah,
have
I've
a
had people
question.
negotiate. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead,
continue
Suzanne.
To be certified, you know, just making sure that, because that's part of the value they bring to us, and their personal value is, you know, being certified in something and wanting to make sure they can continue that. So anything that you're gonna, as Penny said, show your value and how that value will benefit the company.
Yeah. So we do have a question that came in. Is it best to negotiate via phone, email, or in person?
I would say it typically happens via phone or via email. Very rarely does it happen in person. I think email allows you to set the tone and temperature of the negotiations. As you know, Suzanne has indicated that, you know, if you're looking for a period of time in which you would like to respond, and you can state that in the email without feeling the pressure of being on the spot. Typically, you know, a candidate might say, you know, via phone, if they're not comfortable, can I get back to you, you know, in a day or so, or via email? This is the time frame that I expect to have, you know, a response.
Yeah, and I recognize modalities of communication are changing. You know, you may be texting with the employer potentially now. I would say, you know, there's a limit to the, you know, typed word to a point of nuance. So at the end, you know, of the day, you may want to just pick up the phone and make sure you have a conversation and that you're really clear with each other on what you're meaning. If you think there's any confusion in the mode of communication you're using.
Yeah, it's interesting because I would have always thought in person for the longest time. And then now the idea
Well,
of
who would have thought we would hire people over Zoom now? So,
right, really, right. Now
right.
now I'm showing age a little bit, right? But I know I was like, no, you have to do that in person. Of course you do, but wait a minute, half the time we're not even interviewing in person, right? So
Right.
so that makes perfect sense there.
May I just add, you may also have applicant tracking systems that are supporting the process. And so while it's not a computer generated response, there's certainly someone behind the scenes that's facilitating that process, but you may be engaged with a system and opposed to direct engagement with an individual. And so that's fine as well, to be having a little of comfort with that.
Mm.
And one thing is about who you're negotiating with. You may have interviewed with the hiring manager, but the negotiations may end up with HR depending on how the company runs things. So just be aware that it's could be either. So keep that in mind.
Great. I'm thinking of another question that kind of came out of something that you had said, but I see this a lot more recently of internal employees trying to go and get a job offer so that they can negotiate with their current employer to get typically a salary increase. What has been your experience with that? I know I'm going off script a little bit, but what has been your experience with that? Do you see that being successful? Are there tips and suggestions that you would give folks for that, who are purposely looking to get a job offer again to negotiate with their current employer for an increase?
Well, first, I would say that it's not necessary to get a job offer in order to get a promotional increase. I think it's important to have regular conversations with your employer about your needs and desires, but also your contributions. You want to showcase your contributions to the organization and how that reflects in terms of market for the role and responsibility that you have. And if you're interested in taking on additional work, how that might impact your compensation. However, we've been flanked in my experience with times where an individual has been sought out or has sought a role with another organization and has a competitive compensation that has been offered to them. And what we tried to do is to speak about, apples to apples comparisons. It's in an employer's best interest to retain employees, to have employees grow within the organization. And I think that having candid conversations where you can express, the value that you've brought and what you'd like to achieve in your role and how that affects compensation is kind of the baseline of achieving increase in compensation.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Penny. It's really, the first stop should be, internally. And, I always say to the HR team and the rest of the organization, stay close to your people. So what's going on, what they're thinking, so that they don't come to you with an offer and you had no idea that they were looking or maybe not completely satisfied. By the time someone has mentally gone to look for a job, interview for a job to the point where they have an offer, I worry when they come back, are we going to be able to come to an agreement with them that they will really be engaged? I think that, you want to talk about that before you get to that spot. Everyone has a bad day and, you look on whatever, but I think, you really want to talk to your management prior to that, because if we don't know, we can't help or we can't change something that may be easily solvable before taking the mental leap to, oh my gosh, I need a new job. And if you come back with an offer just to counter, that's not necessarily the right tone you want to set either.
Right. I had heard that by the time you've done that, you already have one foot out the door. I
Correct.
can't recall who had shared that, but I remember hearing that at one. I was like, that is kind of true. You've already taken it to that level.
Yeah.
Mentally, right? You probably do have one foot out the door, and maybe it's not even necessary to go through all of that if you're really interested in staying, which is the power of showcasing your value to your current manager and having those continuous conversations of what you bring to the table, right? Looks like we have another question that came in. Can you provide some phrasing for salary negotiation? I am applying for a promotion, but the salary is lower than what other staff in this role are making.
So I'm just trying to clarify, you're applying for a promotion, so you're not being promoted, you're applying for a job that's at a higher level than what they're currently in, is I think what I'm hearing.
Yes, I'm applying for a promotion, but the salary is lower than what? So it sounds like, and feel free, the person who asked the question, to feel free to type, but the way I'm getting it, they already have an understanding that they know the projected salary is going to be lower than what others are making in that role.
So that's where I would go back, and I don't know if you'll know the demographic details of the future peers, but when we talk about a salary range, someone new to a range, may be coming, and if it's a promotion, they may be coming in a little bit lower than people who've been doing that job for a number of years. So just, it's, think about apples to apples. Do they have the exact same profile, exact same experience, exact same degrees, exact same certifications? And have they been in that role that you're being promoted to for a period of time may account for the differences in those salary rate levels. But it doesn't hurt to ask. And that's, again, you are your best advocate for this. You know your skills, you know your background, you know what you can do. So no one's gonna showcase that better than you are.
I would also like to say that I think that it's important to have conversations either with your manager or human resources to ask about the compensation philosophy. Don't wait until it's time for promotion or when you're, considering other opportunities. Have a casual conversation so that you can gain a better understanding of how promotions are achieved and what is that true compensation philosophy at the organization.
Right, and
Whether it's paid.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Suzanne.
For performance, do they target the mid 50th percentile? Do they target higher? I mean, all of that goes into a company's personal pay philosophy.
So the first part of that question was, can you provide some phrasing for salary negotiations? So Penny, it sounds like maybe going in with that, can you help me understand, right? Can you provide what the philosophy is on, is that how you'd go in, or do you have other suggestions for some phrasing to kind of get that conversation started?
Yeah, I would start off with that, and I would go back to, the guidance that we gave earlier with knowing what skills, knowledge, and abilities you bring to the table and how that equates to data that you've gathered from the market in terms of those skill sets.
Great. All right, let's jump right into another question. What are some public and private sector differences to be aware of in negotiating salary and benefits?
So in public sector, there's a lot more transparency with respect to compensation. Oftentimes, you'll see salary ranges posted. I caution you in thinking that the top level of the range is what you might achieve when you're being either promoted or if you're just entering the role. Oftentimes in the public sector, it's a requirement that you start off at the lower end of the range because of the merit system that's established for that organization. Private sector, some organizations post a salary range and others do not. In the state of Connecticut, also in Vermont, depending on what state that you reside in, there are pay transparency laws that require the posting of a range, as well as provide the prohibition of an employer from asking you about your pay background. But doing as much research as possible with respect to what the range is, how you move along those range or band in the private sector is very, very helpful. And there's information on various websites about how to navigate that. You'll see employees who may post information about how to navigate the different pay bands within the organization in the private sector. Also knowing whether or not it's a range or it's a step. Some organizations have what they call step plans, where for every year of service with the organization, you arrive to a step. Though that happens most frequently in unionized environments, such as public organizations or municipal organizations. That's also very, very helpful in understanding. But that doesn't mean that you can't ask for a salary that's higher than the minimum that you're seeing. Sometimes there is flexibility with that, and sometimes there's not. But I always encourage an individual to ask.
I think Penny hit it. And some
right.
companies post ranges and some, internal ranges, and some don't. So it really is company specific.
And with remote work now, I think it's getting harder and harder, and understanding what states. I know New York, for example, I don't know all the states, New York has to disclose salary before when they post a position. Gets really kind of confusing again with the remote work, and I'm in Connecticut and I'm going to potentially work in New York. Is there a good resource website out there that you can recommend so candidates can try to understand what this whole looks like and how to know what's going on with what companies and states have to do?
There's a couple good websites. ADT does a good job of posting information about pay transparency laws across the nation. There's a handful of states that have that requirement. Also, you can check your local Department of Labor website that will provide what are obligations for employers, which translate basically into the law for that particular state. But I would say that if you are looking at a job website at an employer's website, and specifically not an Indeed or another type of a career builder, they should be in compliance with the law. So they would definitely be posting the information that complies with their local laws, and that way you'll have a better sense of what information is available or not available. And you can, always contact that organization's human resources office to try to gain more insight.
Right. I mean, you can call directly, as Penny said. I think the challenge now with the remote work or the hybrid, whatever, is, it leveled the playing field for hiring. You could work from anywhere, but it also is a little tricky depending where the company is located versus where you're going to be located, what laws apply. So I would just reach out to the HR department at that company. They could probably help you, or other public websites that are in Department of Labor.
Looks like we have another question. Does the employer always make a lower offer first, expecting you to ask them to bump it up? Do you have to ask them to bump it up to look good? I like the directness there.
It's a good question. No, generally, I think that employers have a good sense. We rely upon a lot of data sources that we procure in order to make sure that we're pricing a role competitively. And again, going back to what we stated earlier, knowing what those kinds of skill sets are, how valuable they are in the market, that should align with what the employer has. And if it doesn't, be able to convey that information respectfully and politely. Just, you may, if you're, for example, going for a role at a university and there is a similar role that's posted, you may be able to share that information with that employer. If they're comparable institutions, that may be helpful to you, but it's not in the best interest of the employer to underprice a compensation level for an individual, because again, we want to attract the best candidate.
Right. And it's a cultural thing too. I mean, you want to make the best offer you can for the employee for the work that they're going to do. And to go through all the gyrations of you want to kind of make your best first offer, because you also want to attract the candidate. Remember, we're still in selling mode as an employer until you are starting that day. So I don't necessarily think that, and there may be some companies, but I don't think that's a strategy.
Leave a buffer there, right? Not a strategy typically. And I have heard that as well. That makes sense. So you don't have to always ask. I don't think anyway. I don't think you always have to ask for them to bump it up to look good. And I'll answer that one pretty directly. I think you just have to do your research and know. And if the offer is a good one, don't feel as though you have to negotiate just to negotiate for the sake of doing it. Yep. All right, another question too. If you've had discussions, If you've had discussions with colleagues who have comparable skills and education regarding salary, and the disclosed pay is higher than yours, what's the appropriate way to approach this situation? And who would be the best person or department to discuss this matter? It's a good question.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think it's important to on some kind of basis, ask when's the last time a salary audit has been done for either your role or the role in general. People may be at different pay points because of how long they've been with the organization, what kind of skill sets they they possess. So my and my peer may not be equal. But it's an important question to ask, why the compensation may vary between the two individuals. I may have just started a year ago, whereas that person has been with the organization for 5 or more years and is at a higher rate and or has a different skill set. But you want to make sure that you're within the band for that position and ask, how might you go about getting adjustments based upon what you're bringing to the table? Again, it goes back to that organization's compensation philosophy.
Right, so you could ask for your role to be benchmarked and see, and also think about like if you have a pay structure where there's an annual increase, or if it's on your anniversary date, that sometimes will skew, roles that are similar. So it just depends on how they administer pay increases as well.
Do you think it's best to go directly to HR, or would it depend right to the hiring manager or right to your supervisor? How would you recommend initiating the conversation or with
I
him?
I always love it when employees start off the conversation, with their supervisor. I think it's always good to have that relationship where you feel comfortable going to your supervisor or manager. But if you're not comfortable, HR is always a door that you can knock on.
Mhm.
Agree.
Yeah, this question also brings up a really good point about employees talking about salaries, which I think we've heard for a long time. Like, you're not supposed to do that, right? We know people do it. We also know that in certain, like University of Connecticut, for example, it's transparent of what salary everyone, right? So what is your take on, should you ever kind of come out and say that that's how you know if that question comes up? Do you see situations where you almost have to say to employees, we're talking about salary and they shouldn't be doing that? What are the kind of rules around that you've seen?
Well, in Massachusetts now where I am, you can't prohibit employees from talking about salary. I mean, it used to be more like a taboo thing and, you didn't do that, but now that's not something you can do. So, I think it just depends, on your, again, culture and I think as the generations move along in their careers, I think it's changed a bit in terms of how we talk about pay and salary. And in terms of pay equity too. I mean, we've all heard and read a lot about not just, gender pay equity, all kinds of things. So the pay conversation is getting much more transparent. And I think companies are at different levels on that maturity curve in terms of sharing that. But it's certainly not something you can prohibit employees from talking about. And I think, again, it goes back to speaking to your supervisor. I think, that's the relationship that you really want to cultivate in terms of your career projection. They're your career counselor as well. And, your career is in your hands. And it's incumbent upon you to really engage and write your own story. And I think you can do that with partnering with your manager and as well as HR.
Well said.
Great. Okay, take another question. How do you handle when new hires with less experience are being hired at a higher salary than the same role, more experience, especially now that New York has salary ranges in their job listings?
I think it would depend upon the circumstance. It may have been a while since the incumbent had been in the role, and it goes back to whether or not there's been a job evaluation and maybe the benchmark has changed for that role. Also, it's affected by the number of viable candidates. Sometimes we find difficulty in the ability to attract talent, and so those decisions help shape compensation levels for individuals. So there's a mix of reasons why somebody who is less experienced may be coming in at a higher compensation level than somebody who has, been in that role. So if it's been 5 years since you've been hired in that role and they're coming in at a higher salary than what you would expect, the market conditions may have changed or the pool of applicants has necessitated that kind of decision making.
And the merit increases that they may have budgeted or allocated may not have kept pace with the marketplace. So if someone leaves, oftentimes when you have to go higher in the market, the range may have shifted. So I think it's all about trying to stay up to date with those market forces and economic forces. And I think we didn't talk about it too much, but it really depends on the economy plays a big role in hiring and labor. So, you know, before there was, you know, there's sort of a pendulum between who's in the driver's seat, if you will, the employee or the employer, depending on the market, and it's supply and demand. So it's something to keep in mind.
That's very true. All right. In your experience, we've talked a lot about what to do for right for showcasing value and negotiating. Where do many candidates fall short in their negotiations, either with their current employer or with a potential employer? What do they do wrong? And what should folks here not do?
Don't be aggressive. I think that understanding what your value in terms of your skills, knowledge, and abilities is extremely helpful. Most folks find difficulty with pricing that, understanding what that value is in the conversation. And I think also where candidates fall short is negotiating item per item. We talked a little bit about negotiating for multiple things simultaneously, because you'd hate to be in a situation where you're saying, well, I'd also like this. You know, I think understanding the full picture of what you're trying to achieve when entering into negotiations is often helpful in your counterpart understanding, you know, what your needs are. But most certainly, being polite and respectful goes a long way.
I would agree. And just, you know, we've said do your homework and ask, but ask politely, right? Know the constraints they're under as well, in terms of balancing budgets, hiring needs, and it's not an unlimited pool or an unlimited number of slots as well.
All right, looks like a couple more questions have come in. So one, I was recruited in interviews for a much better job with a top range of compensation and benefits this week. So congrats. I have approached my current supervisor for such an increase several times. Do I have to consider any counter offer?
If that individual provides you with a counter, I think you want to be open to it. I think it's also a question you might ask if not now, is it something that we could revisit in the future? And what would be those ideal conditions?
Okay.
It sounds like, though, if you've already been talking with your supervisor about this and they haven't taken you, you know, gone through with much follow through on that, and that you've started looking, it's kind of the way I'm reading this question. If they counter, there's, you know, that's an interesting and certainly will make you feel valued. But if this is a different, better opportunity from all angles, not just comp, remember the comp is one piece of what your day-to-day life is going to be. Then, you know, you're just balancing that.
Okay. Let's see. If you're an independent contractor who wants to foster a long-term relationship with an organization, what's the best approach to have in being paid fairly for services or products with regards to negotiations? Should the first question be in asking what budget range they have for those particular services?
It sounds like this person is a 1099, meaning they're a direct contractor versus going through a contracting house. Because usually if you're going through a contracting house, there's their rate and then there's the fringe they put on top of that. If they're going direct, I mean, it's you, it's your business, and you need to know, again, your value, what is your rate? And again, if you don't believe in your value and your rate, then who else is, right? So if you feel like you've got these skills, they're worth this amount, I would suggest that's what you go in with. You can always negotiate, but put it out, what's your rate? And if you do normal cost increases or whatever it is, build that into your business and your business model. But I would say you really have to believe in yourself, particularly if you're an independent, and your value, and know that that's worth and not compromise too much.
Mm. All right, I like this next question. Are there any books, literature, resources you recommend that may assist with strategic negotiation skill development?
UConn has some really good classes. I'm also an adjunct for UConn in the Department of Public Policy, where I teach human resources. But I do believe that there is a negotiations course at the School of Business that one could participate in. There are some good Harvard business articles about negotiations that would certainly be insightful and that transcend beyond compensation. Just having the fundamental negotiation skills would help you in everyday circumstances or in your business work. So they go beyond the scope of salary negotiation.
I think there's lots of good books, seminars out there on negotiating. And again, it goes, as Penny said, not just this, but whatever you're buying or selling.
Yeah.
Or looking to do.
All right, let's see. We have one more. Okay. How to approach a negotiation when a company is highly unlikely to budge? We don't know the why necessarily around why they'd be unlikely to budge, but this person says HR makes the decision, not the supervisor. But how do you approach negotiations when you kind of go in and you already feel like you're not going to be successful?
I would start off by asking what might be, constraints that they're facing. I think it's really good when you're negotiating with anyone that you understand your counterpart's constraints, that you're having conversations, not where you're disclosing, advantage points, but certainly you want to understand what they're dealing with. And so if there's a budgetary reason why they're not able to expand their offer, you want to understand what that might be or any other constraints that they're facing. There may be areas in which you are able to negotiate on other points that might not be specifically compensation related, because it goes back to what we talked about, total compensation. Some organizations provide employees a total compensation value statement so that you have a clear understanding of your total compensation package, but you can ask those questions, during the negotiations process.
If I'm reading this question correctly about, I think it was also merit and cost of living. I just want to draw this distinction between cost of living and cost of labor. So folks know about cost of living, which is the COLA and what you read in the paper and inflation, everything else. Cost of labor is different. It doesn't necessarily match that. So I know in people's heads, they think, wow, there's all this inflation and my raise should match that. It's a little bit different. So it's not right or wrong, but it is different. So just consider that because just as they get salary surveys, they get merit surveys the companies subscribe to, which will tell them what are people budgeting for, next fiscal year. So
that's a great point. All right, I see that our time is dwindling. Would the two of you have anything to add, any last bits of advice or wisdom before I turn it over to Patrick? You've said it all.
This was a conversation. I just wanted to remind folks that, when you're negotiating, it's important that you negotiate with a person who has the ability to negotiate terms with you. And again, don't underestimate the importance of being polite or even being liked.
Yeah, and agree. This is a great conversation, great question. So thank you. And I would just remind you, know your value and your values. What are you willing, what works for you in terms of your value system as well.
Right. And I would end that with the power of a smile. So in being likable in negotiations, it is very important to smile. There is lots of power in a smile and being confident. So that is my last bits of advice as well. I don't see any other open questions unless you do, Patrick, but I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, again, looking right now, there are no other questions. So, at this time, I want to thank Jennifer and Penny and Suzanne for their time and expertise today. And thank you all for joining us on this webinar. Be sure to check out uconalumni.com/events for UConn alumni happenings that are going to be in your area. In the meantime, though, again, thank you all for your participation and hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.